Okay. Now, so many of you have grown up or been part of other societies, the United States or in the United Kingdom or in France, Germany. You know, we're a multinational, and you've probably experienced different education systems. Societies and countries have different approaches to education. And also changes take place over time. Some of you reflected on maybe, you know, the way you went to say middle school, and now you're maybe a younger brother and younger sister. You're getting a very different education. There's changes that are taking place over time. We start with the Greeks. That is going back to the 5th century BC. 469 BC, when Socrates was born, and he died in 399 BC. And so we started back there. Now, why? It's a sort of starting point, an archetype. Do you know that word, archetype? It's a sort of genke, 日本語で kind of an original form. And actually, when you look at the origins, どこからもの始まった? Where did things start? Well, when we look at the role of education, of course we can go further back than the Greeks, but it's a sort of a starting point for how we look at, you know, how did education evolve, especially for our liberal arts education. How are youth taught? Who has the right to teach? How should they be taught? And these questions of, you know, why educate, for what purpose, how, and who has the right to decide what gets learned, these are perennial questions. The word archetype means the origin. Perennial means things that happen over and over again, all through almost kind of throughout all times. You know, they're always there. There are questions that are concern us today in Japan or the United States or in Europe. These are questions that are debated actively even today, even though they're questions which we can see coming out of 2,000 some years ago. We talked about these sorts of, you know, why, what type of education? Education for the state, education to promote patriotism, education to promote loyal and obedient citizens who will follow orders, or a type of education that cultivates individual thinking, individual independence, individual intelligence, individual abilities. In other words, and then we kind of contrasted, you know, two big areas like kyoiku wa kuni no tame, for the sake of the state, or maybe for the sake of the individual, the kojin, the individual. So we looked at those two areas. We also looked back when we looked at the ancient Greeks. We saw that Socrates was giving you, well, there's a kind of an old education that Nussbaum meant, like the military education, or respect for the gods, learn the epics, the great stories of the past, the stories of the gods, their heroic, how they dedicated themselves to courage and to honor and to fighting skills, to patriotism. And so certain countries had a sort of like a Bible, or even like Homer, a type of a text which they considered as a model for citizens. And you learn that. And it comes out of tradition, and you try to get young people to conform to tradition, conform to the ideal model. Socrates was questioning that model. He was questioning tradition, and that's why he got into trouble too. He wanted young people to think for themselves and not just simply kind of conform to some established model. His was a form of teaching. He was a professor, and he asked questions, and he wanted to get answers, and he wanted to be questioned. And that sort of, and wanted to kind of encourage thinking. So yes, you read, you experience, but you think. And he is that type of, a scholar, professor, a teacher who encourages questioning. And we talked about the Socratic method. But also in the Greeks, as we saw today, another form of education was we're going to see it today, it was actually drama. The Greek dramas, the plays, and you can consider the playwright, the person who writes plays, as also a professor, as someone who wants people, when they see something, not just simply to laugh and enjoy themselves, but to think, to pose questions through the form of drama. It's also a form of mass public education. Now we have all sorts of different forms of entertainment. We can read books. We can, they're kind of individualized. You can go to a cinema and watch the film you want. You can go to the theater. You can, but in Greek times, there was kind of, there was various forms. Often they were public, where everyone went. The theater was not just, it was a small city state. So when a playwright put on a play, it was expected that almost all the citizens would come and see it. It's a public forum, a public space. And so that's what I want to talk about today. By the way, just a little history. Or was actually the time of both the very peak of Greek, classical Greek civilization, democracy in Athens, also the decline. It's a time of a lot of turmoil, a lot of problems in society, but particularly once Athens went top, there were many other city-states, particularly Athens' rival was Sparta, a very different type of society, a military society, a society that didn't encourage questioning, that education was kind of like going into the army. You learn what the state tells you, you become a soldier, you fight for your country. That type of, a very different style of education, a very different society, Sparta. And they're sort of, both of them sort of archetypes, kind of original types, genke, of a civilization that's more democratic and one that's more totalitarian and much more military. And there's a war, the Peloponnesian War. The war begins around 431 BC and goes to 404 BC. So, the great, historian Thucydides wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War. And you see, it's pretty much the same time as Socrates' life. And he was, so in the background, of course, Athens is at war and not winning the war because in 404, defeated. And during this time, especially toward the end of the war, as Athenians were losing the war, there were several occasions in which people said, maybe our style of government isn't good. Maybe we need a more authoritarian style. Maybe, and a couple attempts at coup d'etat, take over the government. So it's all in that context. As Athens is kind of getting weaker, that Socrates is playing the role of, remember that gadfly, playing the role of this like a bee trying to sting the horse. Get going, get going. Strengthen yourself, wake up. And it's also during this time that there are more and more people who are, criticizing Socrates because not only is the country going down, but then you have somebody out there encouraging protest, encouraging dissent. And so, the government is not is not really appreciating Socrates' advice. Okay, it's in that time. And during this time, as I say, there's kind of two types of education. And both of them play into or part of what we look at as the origin of a liberal arts education. One is the education that Socrates offered to at that time, is basically only to the young men. And encourage them to ask questions, to engage in debate, to have dialogues, and to kind of think for themselves in the open forums, open debates in Athens. So, and this is in the writings of Plato. You get many of these dialogues. Socrates asking questions, encouraging that type of education where we see Socrates as the professor. Continual questions and demand for critical thinking. The other type of education was that of the playwrights as professors. Socrates his contemporaries are people like Aristophanes, Sophocles, Aristophanes, Aeschylus, various other very well famous, and you can look them up if you look under the history of Greek drama. And these playwrights were also a form of education. They, in fact, were called, if you were a playwright, you were called a teacher. Just like Socrates was called a teacher, a person who wrote plays was also called sensei, teacher. And they too asked questions, and they too demanded critical thinking. So it's so the type of questions that are asked by Socrates in his dialogues and in his questions, and which are posed in plays by the playwrights, may be different. And certainly this type of questions that were concerned to people back in the 5th century BC are different from the type of issues that we're confronted with today, so many years later. But in both cases, the demand to think critically, the role of questioning, to make people, what is it called, to develop a free thinker, person who is independent-minded, was both, again, it's back then and back now is kind of the core of this education. Plays were performed sometimes in a sort of one after another. It's like an annual or sometimes biannual event. And the audience could be not just a few hundred, but maybe a few thousand. Often it was a large, when there was a play, if you've seen an amphitheater, like often a large amphitheater, a big theater, where there would be seats for over 1,000 people looking down at the center. And the poets, dramatists, teachers, they used the old myths, the old stories, the epics. They were stories that everybody knows. And yet they come out of the Homeric tradition. Some of you know the Iliad and the Homer's, the writings of Homer, or the epics. People knew these stories. They used that, but they reinterpreted it. They added a little bit. They focused on one area or another area, and they took the shared tradition, but often exposed it and made people think about it is this exactly, you know, in other words, instead of just being a passive recipient of the tradition, they tried to encourage people to think and maybe even reinterpret, rethink the meaning of these stories. Okay. And raise questions. Now, what's the question? What you looked at Antigone? How many of you actually managed? The translation that I gave you is sort of old style English. I know it's kind of hard to read, right? But could you follow it? There are questions in there. What's happening? What's the tragedy? Can anybody very quickly summarize Antigone? It was written in or before 441. It's before the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. So, a tragedy. Sophocles is the author. There's this number. But before, you can't read that. But so, Dodeska, anybody remember what the play is about? Anything about the play that you thought was interesting? So, you know, there's two types of law here. In a little bit, there's you know, the king, and this is a man named Creon, and he's just become powerful. Remember, there's a war in the play, and the people who are fighting are two brothers. They kill each other, and so this Creon becomes the king, and he becomes sort of like an absolute king. And he makes the law that the one brother who was living in the kingdom will be recognized as a hero who fought and died for his country. The other brother is a traitor. And so no funeral rites. And then the sister said, well, I really want to, you know, even though it's the law of the state, she says, well, maybe there are other higher laws, like the family, or he's my sister, you know, it's a family, or maybe even the gods. Which is the, you know, there's a sort of competing laws here, competing. Who should I obey? Where is my ultimate loyalty? You know, and that you can immediately put into kind of Japanese context if you think of loyalty, chuseishin. You know, like the samurai, you know, are you loyal to your family or are you loyal to your lord? You know, and actually that's kind of comes out even in more recent times. Sometimes salarymen say, oh, who are you most loyal to, your company or to your wife? It's the same sort of, what is this, between a rock and a hard place. And many people are forced to make that choice. And quite often, until recently, you know, family got gisei sareta, kind of families got sacrificed because, oh yes, I have to do this for my company. Even sometimes leading to karoshi, to kind of death. So, you know, there are tragedies, modern forms of this tragedy too. Okay, well now, that is one aspect of the thing that you thought interesting. Who are the main actors? Who are main characters in this play? Remember?
Well, the name of the play is
Antigone, yeah.
Antigone and her father.
Her father.
Oh no, her uncle.
It's her uncle. Yeah. Her father was actually Oedipus.
Oh right.
And there's a part of the name, the Oedipus.
This is the one that married
His mother. I mean, there's a so there's that part of the thing is there. But this is we're not worried about that area here. We're looking at Antigone. She appears in various other plays too, but now she is a hero. She's a very strong-willed woman. And so there's Antigone and her uncle Creon. Who else?
Her fiance.
Her fiance is Haemon. Not Haemon, but Haemon. Okay, and And of course, kind of Romeo and Juliet style, they both die at the end, right? It's tragedy. Young lovers, okay. Who else? What?
Her brothers.
Her brothers.
I can't remember their names, but just two brothers.
There's a sister.
Something.
Esme, her the sister, and the sister doesn't go along, right? Okay, so it's actually there are not too many characters really. Now, what's the tragedy? In the end up everybody dies. You know, in the end, Antigone dies, and her fiance Haemon dies, and then the Creon's wife, what's her name? Eurydice. She tries to be an intermediary, but then she kills herself because you know. I think Creon stays alive, but he's sort of stuck with all of this, you know. Okay, it's pretty tragic. Now, let's just take a look. You know, there's various things in here, and remember, you are the audience. You're watching this play, and as you watch the play, of course, you think about your own lives, your own situations, and not only your own personal. What would you do if you were Antigone? And but also, you're not only thinking about your family situation. You have some say, what's going on in our society right now? Is our democracy, you know, is it, and you are in a democratic state, but actually there's the potential for what would happen if we had a government that is kind of a very strong leader like Creon, and we're not allowed to protest, we're not allowed to participate. When he demands that his law is the only law that we should respect. So there's all, you know, there's politics in the play as well that you as an audience are thinking about as you watch it. I'm going to try to show you the first scene. Could you follow it? 大丈夫? わかった? Now, how about we take about 5-minute break? 休憩 just 5分だけ. And then I want to come back and I want to have some more discussion about what you saw, what you think about what are the various themes, even just in here. You might have, you know, there's words in here like justice, whose law is supreme, authority, power, who has the right to, you know, tell me who I love and who I don't love. All sorts of kind of issues are raised in this point. And again, imagine yourself as not just simply kind of entertainment, but you kind of talk among yourselves as you see this, and say, what did you think? What you know? This is to actually encourage people to kind of think and imagine. You know, what if you were in those? What would you do? What Antigone does? Would you be like the sister and saying, no, I can't, I'm just a kind of a weak woman, I can't stand against that, you know? Or would you be more like Antigone? What would you do? Make up some ideas, and actually I'm hoping to get lots of discussion, lots of ideas, so maybe you might want to, if you have a chance, even write down something that you want to say, okay? So, what are the issues? What's going on in this play? And as I say, remember this play is being produced not for private entertainment, but almost for public education. It's assumed that everybody, well, the free people of the city will come and watch it. And very likely, not just men, but women too. Okay, so what are the questions being asked? What's what's the, remember I said, like Socrates, it makes you ask questions. The playwright, Sophocles, is also asking questions. So what are the questions? I'll start you off. The very obvious one is, to whom do we, citizens of Athens, owe ultimate loyalty? Your loyalty is, who do you owe it to? And again, if you've studied Japanese history, you know that loyalty is, in the Confucian ideas, there's the kun and the shin. Kun is the Lord. Shin is the servant. And kun to shin no aida ni wa chu. Tada, loyalty. でしょ? Between the kun and shin. But then there is also oya to ko. And so there's the oya and ko. And then there's kyodai. Oya, but it's usually oni-san and ototo to oni-san, ne? Older brother, younger brother. And there's certain types of duties. If, between, there's this sort of chu to ko. Which is stronger? This one is much more political. And this one is more kind of familial, within the family, within more personal. Which is stronger, chu or ko? 本当はchu ko ichi. It'd be nice if we could say always the same. Chu and ko are both strong, but which is stronger? Some societies, so loyalty to the Lord is stronger. Others say, well, my loyalty to my father is stronger. My duty to my father is stronger. And sometimes you have to make a choice, right? So here's for the citizens. Where is your ultimate loyalty is being asked. Okay? Do we owe to the state or to the family? Which laws are stronger? So that's it. So as I say, put yourself in Antigone's shoes or her mind. Think that you were her. What would you do? Or, compare here. Maybe compare her with her sister. That's the first basic thing. So, どうですか? Anybody think about that?
I think going along with that idea, like this play was mainly about like what are their priorities, like Antigone and
priorities is a good one. Yeah.
Means, like, priority. What do they like value
the most?
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so, what's Antigone's priority? Family love, family ties, blood. Okay, very personal connections. Even though the government has said you can't bury him. In the, I study history, and I'm actually Meiji Restoration, Meiji Shin, Bakumatsu Meiji. And at 1868, there was a civil war in Japan. Kateba Kangun and the Boshin Senso. And the same thing happened. The Satsuma Choshu group went out, and in Tohoku, there's lots of wars. Tohoku, maybe you saw some from 2年前でしたかな? About Nijima, what's her name? Sakura no Yai no Sakura? 見ました? あれはshe was a strong woman from Aizuhan, and 後で新島城と結婚しましたね. But she studied to be rifling. But in that war against the Kangun, if you died, the order was you leave the bodies of the Zokugun, in other words, the Aizugun, just left, さらして。で、猫じゃなくて犬とか狐とか虫とかね、全部食ってしまうよ、殻そのまま。You just leave it out. But the 官軍の方はちゃんとお墓を作って、あとは仏教のお葬式もして、やっぱりこうちゃんとする。または後で靖国神社入る。で、この人入らない。Not only that, they said you're even the, and if you were a Buddhist priest and hisokani, you went out to bury the dead, you get in trouble. それも実際に this case is exactly like this in Japan at the time of Meiji Restoration. And many of the Westerners were surprised. How come they're not burying the dead of the enemy? But it's that was so. It's not a it's not a. This is a real case, and it's happened till very recently, probably even now, happening in wars. So, but even if you're a trader, you have a family, and your family feels some obligation to you. Okay. So, what are the priorities, right? Anybody else? What would you do? You'd resist? You'd prioritize, even though it means death. And see, that's the putting it, remember the rock in the hard place. This is the extreme situation. You won't just be punished a little bit and say, ikenai yo, but you're going to be stoned to death. They say public stoning. The laws were very harsh.
But I think one prominent quote that Antigone said was like, aren't you like proud to be Oedipus's daughter?
Yeah.
Like something along those lines. I don't remember the exact phrasing, but I think that was like argument.
Very strong, yeah. Heard, yeah.
Also the fact that like they're saying, well, sometimes people say like even if there's like a public stoning, the consequences are met. But so even if you go along with this laws and like you know you don't give a proper burial to your other brother or the other brother,
Yeah.
but you still have to live with yourself.
Yeah.
So it's like a metaphorical death,
Mm.
I guess.
Yeah.
It's either physical death or
Yeah.
like for her, it's kind of like to her morality.
Yeah.
It's a death of her, like
Mm.
what she needs.
Yeah, and when at one point she says, what's the worst they can do me is kill me. But so she has obligations, and they are sort of moral obligations. They are also religious obligations, emotional obligations to her family, which she prioritizes. But what about the sister? Anybody can sympathize with the sister? She said, oh, too weak. I can't do it like you. Yeah. And also notice that she uses the argument, we're just women. Kind of, this particular performance sort of particularly emphasized that more like gender issues in the play. And actually Sophocles used women, actually was a champion of women's rights, sometimes said women being more sensible than men, less emotional, and often sometimes women oppose war or path. Hey, this is senseless to go out and fight. But here it also women are actually seen quite heroic. So there's also Antigone is making something like almost like women's revolt against men. Is it a man's world that we live in, that women have to always bow down to and accept? That's a sort of questioning mode that make people think. When she gave that speech about, well, we're just women, Well, what do you mean? We are, she kind of, you might say the kind of beginnings of a women's liberation movement. Should we not question the fact that our society is controlled by men? And often the men, and some of the women thought they were smarter than men. They probably were. Yet, because they're men, you have to bow down to them. So maybe also sort of classic between women and men. Who should we just simply bow down? And of course, with it's not just bureaucratic power, the role of law, but it's also the role of a patriarchal society. So what's being asked there is a question: what is the role of women in society? And the audience is invited to think about that, to debate it. Maybe, if there's a kind of husband and wife or brothers and sisters sitting in the audience and they sing that, the wife, or other ones, look here, why do I have to always bow down to you? Just bring your tea all the time. There's sort of, again, it's a type of education. You see, it's posing questions. Is it, and probably similar sorts of literature and drama and cinema in our world today also have gender issues very much at their core. Is it right just to keep quiet and obey men? Is that the world order we should accept? Probably not. No. Okay. So, what else? Who else? What other things going on here? You see what I mean by Antigone being between a rock and a hard place? It's a sort of, there's another much more vulgar phrase, damned if you do, damned if you don't. Either way, it's not so good, on the one hand, she could be a loyal citizen, but she would betray her family. She could follow her heart and love her brother, but then she will become, she will then be a traitor against the state. And many of these plays have that type of message. Can you think of any other, say, have you read any literature that has a message in it beyond kind of entertainment or even a television program in society today? What is that? You watch any television program that's not just simply somebody gets hit and haha, isn't that funny? But there is actually a message in there. Have you read even some of the writings of Murakami Haruki? There usually is a type of message, or even in anime. Yeah.
Well, I think it's very different. Also, you can find similarities. I think a lot of people have read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn.
Yeah.
And again, the main character is kind of in a position where he would be a weaker individual in society because how is a boy and he's very young.
poses a question, and then also that as a doksha, you know, what would I do in that case? And you're made to think a little bit. You know, Huckleberry Finn's a good one like that. Lots of, and there's a whole question of slavery in that thing as well, you know, and freedom, because they're on the river, their freedom and slavery issues, that sort of issues is there too. Okay. Sophocles is like Socrates in that both see there's a political message as well as a sort of moral message, you know. And democracy is an ideal of the Greeks rather than dictatorship. And that the point is that one person, one king, should not rule by himself and be kind of absolute ruler. That the rule of more people than one, more democratic, is preferable. And so, you know, Creon is his tragic circumstances there. You know, after the battle, and so he's making the rules by himself, and he's very proud. He's going to well, there's been wars. He's going to set up a new government, and he is going to be the king, and he's going to, you know, people are going to be loyal only to him, and this is going to be the new age of peace. But and of course, the women have to bow down to him too. But there's criticism of this style of government is in the play as well. He wants to emphasize that the dictator, the king, will more normally make decisions that benefit himself rather than the good of society. Whereas democracy is a form of government that's going to try to help, ideally, should benefit public good, the people, rather than just the individual. So he wants to show, Creon wants to kind of put out the king's laws is the gland of the law, and it's more important than blood, more important than family. But remember, this is a time where just, you know, there's the potential of war with Sparta, and there's this, you know, and it's a sort of playing the role, like we said before, of Socrates, the gadfly. Kind of wake up. This is what we could be. This is what our society could become if we lose our democracy. Now, this sort of, I keep trying to bring this up there. Can you think of a similar sort of dilemma in the world today? In Japan, in the United States, in Europe, Middle East? Anybody, can you think of a similar sort of caught between a rock and a hard place? You know, what, damned if I do, damned if I don't, kind of, that could be the basis of a drama that we could make today. Anybody have some any things reading from the newspapers?
Well, this is regarding like American politics and foreign policy, but in the States, like governors and politicians came up to get the votes of the people, and just like the turnover rate is really fast, and so like when they like make decisions for their platforms, they tend to like say things that like for sure people are gonna vote for them, when in reality like things like green politics that should be implemented, but then like I don't think, well I think in reality people think that it's like too big of a change, or like they wouldn't feel too comfortable voting for like that type of platform, and so the politicians end up sticking with like what they have now, and like considering the future they should move or like push for green politics. And because America's like a superpower, they have the capacity to influence the world, and if they proceed with green politics, then like the whole world would start a whole like green revolution. But because of, you know, because they're interested in being voted again, and like to like remain in position, they can't do that.
That's basically what's happening, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's becoming a tragedy rather than,
Yeah.
you know, it starts off very nicely and so forth, and then in the end it's sort of quite ironic that when Obama first became president, he had lots of hope, lots of expectation, even got the Nobel Peace Prize. And most recently, he is basically saying, well, we have to go to war in Syria. And trying to persuade the Congress to go to war. And so it's his positions. This is what politics does. Okay, that's one thing. Anybody else? Just look around and say Japan, anything?
Like, I guess to solve the whole demographics issue of having like too many like elderly and like less of the young population. I guess like we all know that like we should be like producing offspring so that like we can like fix the demographics if we can to a more sustainable level. But I don't think people want to sacrifice their careers or jobs, and so that's a dilemma of the society.
Yeah, that's a hard one too, isn't it? On the one hand, society encourages women to be independent and free and get a job and be, free from men. And yet there's to say, well, you should really get married, have lots of children, stay at home, take care of them. And this is the wrong role of women. All of a sudden you get this sort of, well, what should I do? and sometimes people who chose one get criticized, or if they chose the other get criticized. It's a hard place, isn't it? But can you imagine then either a television program or a movie or a theater that takes that issue up and then to the audience? But the thing that's more about the Greek is that, as I say, it's sort of very public, what everybody should go and see. And there was an idea that you would discuss this. One thing that I thought of just recently, 2 American journalists were executed, killed by the Islamic terrorists, they call the Islamic Nation or ISIS. And their videos were put on YouTube. I didn't look at that, maybe you did. It's gruesome, but if you want to see kind of heads being chopped off. But that happened. And the thing is, and that's of course one of the issues, well, should America go to war now or support troops or bombings and so forth. But let's go, there's the American public. Let's go to the families of those journalists. Now, the families of the journalists, their loved ones have been executed, basically in their seat of picture. But not only that, the American journalists were not the only journalists, who were captured and detained by the Islamic terrorists. There were many other people, and it was the policy of some governments in Europe, particularly, that to get their people back, they would pay money. It's called ransom. It might be $1 million, a lot of money, but some governments in France or Germany and so forth, Holland, they pay the money and they got their loved ones back. But it's American policy not to pay ransom. So the American government policy is we do not deal with terrorists, and if they demand money, it's our position that we do not pay. That's hardline state policy. Even though the families, if we go down and look at the actual situation of these 2 people who were, they were detained for many years, families were in contact. They knew that they were asked to pay $1 million. And actually, they even, after one wish, it went up to like $1,300,000. And the families are saying, please pay it, we will get the money. And people say, yes, we have the money, we'll pay the ransom. American government says, no, you cannot pay the money. It's not our policy. It's the law of the countries to pay, not pay ransom. Okay? You see that it's the same dilemma, isn't it? You know, the family wants to have their loved one back. People got the money, they'll pay, but the government says no. And then in the process, the other people who were freed, but not the Americans, because the American government didn't want to pay money, and said it's the laws that you don't pay money, and they were killed. So now the family are kind of course, upset, both at the tragedy, but also at the government, because why didn't we could have saved our loved ones. And you see, that's a sort of dilemma again, because of their state power, and that story is kind of not really well known about ransom and paying money, and other countries. Some countries do it, other countries don't. But it's a sort of a dilemma, a sort of a no ransom policy, despite the pleas of the family to pay. They kept to its no ransom policy. The men were killed. It's a tragedy. Now, this could be also a modern Greek tragedy in the same style, and if presented to the American public or to the world public, would encourage kind of debate, discussion about this issue. Is America's policy? Well, of course, the other kind is bad too. But how about the policy of no ransom? And maybe it's a sort of again, which side is right, but it encourages at least to think and discuss and debate this sort of issue. In other words, our world is not black and white. And it's kind of necessary for us to develop our own position, our own point of view, and perhaps even, understand that not everybody's going to agree with us, and there will be others who will disagree and criticize, but actually that's my point of view. And kind of live with that circumstance. Perhaps being kind of open, yes, okay, I'm open to arguments, I'm open to discussion about it, but here's what I think, here's what you think, it's different. You remember, again, kind of one of the voices that create modern, what's called civil society, shimin shakai, is that of Voltaire at the time of the French Revolution, and defending free speech. And he said that I may disagree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. And that expecting that a civil society requires free speech, participation, and we'll deal with this issue of free speech later in our course. So one of the readings is on free speech, and are there limits to free speech? Sometimes, free speech can be actually detrimental to society rather than invigorating. And that's a sort of issue that we'll deal with later. But did you get the idea about play? About plays, not play, that they're very serious and have messages, and that it is in a sense a form of education, so that when you watch television, when you go to the theater, when you go to watch movies, you do have a chance, quite often some of them are rather serious and pose questions that you can think about. Some are completely just mindless. But try to look at those really serious problems and kind of take up the issues. And also when you read books, okay? And that's learning. It's not the sort of learning that we get in classrooms and so on, but it's also part of your ningen keisei, and developing your own way of thinking from drama, from literature, from art. Okay.
Recently, The Giver became a movie. The Giver, the novel.
Oh, The Giver. Yes, yeah. That's an old. Is it for children? Is it really for children?
Well,
In middle school, yeah.
But it was like about dystopian utopian society and about like killing your individuality.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Good, good, good. Okay. Now, let's stop. Where is it? Oh, it's a little bit early, but anyway, I want you to write some comments. Anybody got questions? Some of you have been silent. I'm trying to get everybody to participate. Anybody have some more issues about Antigone? You see why I stressed Socrates is often usually stressed, but at that same time in the Greek period here, as looking back at a sort of, genke, an archetype, an origin of the type of education that encourages us to question tradition, to think creatively and critically. It's not just the Socrates side, but also in the art and literature of that time and the drama. And that also exists for us today as an avenue for learning. Okay, the next thing we're going to do in our class is go to the 7 liberal arts. Do you know what the 7 liberal arts are? Like grammar and rhetoric and logic and mathematics. And then there's also, what else is in there? Various music. So these are, when we sometimes look at the liberal arts, we kind of immediately go back and say, well, what are they? What type of studies are they? Well, and originally there wasn't just 7. There was, there's the various different ways, but by the time in the Roman Empire, just around maybe like 300, 400 AD, like about 100 years, about from here, almost like 1,000 years later, that Greek tradition kind of develops a more systematic form. And say, well, there's 7 liberal arts. Okay, we'll look at those, what they are. But still, even though we're going to look at, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them. Maybe there's a few more, astronomy and so forth. Even though we look at them, it's not so much the content, but it's the kate, this process, how you teach them, how you learn them is really going to be important. So I want to look at that how this tradition changed from the Greeks into the Roman and an early medieval period. So that's what we do next tape. And there is some readings here. First of all, the 7 liberal arts, 12th century. There's actually a painting, and then there's also in a church in France, Chartres. Anybody been there? Beautiful cathedral. If you go to France, well, of course there's Notre Dame, but Chartres is beautiful. But it has the 7 liberal arts on part of its and the entrance. They're all kind of, so you can kind of see them, the allegory. So I just want you to read the 7 liberal arts and the west door of Chartres and the 7 liberal arts and allegory explained.
I have a question about
Good.
the conclusion.
Okay, just a second.
Okay.
This is what we're going to talk about next Monday, okay? Try to understand this picture. Okay, yeah. Let's go back to Antigone.
What did you think about how it ended and like how that conclusion connects with society? Like at the end, they all die.
They all die.
Yeah. So is it like
You were saying 1984, they all
Yeah.
die. I guess, the drama, the tragedy, usually ends in people dying. Sometimes suicide, and it's a sort of, well, how else can we, the option is to have a good ending, happy ending. But tragedies very rarely have happy endings, like Romeo and Juliet. They even if Juliet isn't really dead, he thinks she's dead. He thinks she's dead, so she killed her. Then she wakes up and kills herself after all. So there's just, I guess, for the dramatic purposes, you have for tragedy, and then also the tragedy has the most impact on society. So the fact that you're left in the end with the king, with not only his wife is dead, and his son is dead, and his son's bride is dead, and all around him everybody has, and it's only because of his own pride. He was saying, I'm going to be king. I'm going to make the laws. I am the king now. And that, well, the Greeks call it hubris, that pride, arrogance, has brought on his downfall and his total, and this death all around him. And I think for the audience, that's it's not only the fact that people have died, but they're also pointing his figure at the king, at the absolute ruler, and he has brought on his own downfall. And I guess just that the dramatic impact of all those deaths there. And, it would be really nice if there was a happy ending, and Antigone got pardoned, or the king changed his mind and so forth. And that might have actually, might be but won't have the impact to the audience.
I think it did have more effectiveness, since the message is more strong.
Strong, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But some of the Greek plays are comedies. And comedy is also sometimes extreme, but also had the same similar effect by carrying things out to the extreme. So the comedies also can, by impact, also make you think. And some of them are satires. And so there's, I guess both comedies and tragedies kind of carry things out a little bit beyond what's our normal life for the impact on the audience. By the way, if listening to the YouTube is hard to understand, and also reading the English is hard to understand, Antigone, of course, and all the Greek plays are translated into Japanese, and so you can easily read some of these plays in Japanese translation, or a translation in other languages as well. Okay, as soon as you finish with your comment sheet, please bring it up here, and then we'll see you on Monday and talk about the 7 liberal arts.